the Tsisu faith. In the aftermath of widespread arrests, the city of guerrillas had transformed into a battleground. The once bustling streets were now a chaotic labyrinth of defiance and repression, with the relentless pulse of protest beating through every corner of the city. The night sky was illuminated by the glow of streetlights and the flicker of torches held aloft by thousands of protesters, their faces set in grim determination as they marched in unison, their cries echoing through the narrow alleys and open squares. Inside cramped police cells, countless followers of Kodo were detained, their spirits unbroken despite the harsh conditions. The cells, designed to hold only a few, were packed to the brim with men and women whose only crime was their unwavering belief in Kodo and the teachings of the Tsisu faith. Their voices, though muffled by the thick walls and iron bars, continued to rise in chants and hymns, a chorus of resistance that defied their captors. Outside, the scene was one of escalating tension. The streets were filled with protesters, their ranks swelling with each passing hour as more joined the cause. The banners they carried fluttered in the wind, emblazoned with slogans demanding justice for Kodo and the immediate release of all those unjustly detained. Their voices, raised in unison, created a deafening roar that reverberated through the city, a sound that could not be ignored by those in power. At the forefront of the protest, a phalanx of heavily armored police officers stood like an unyielding wall. Their faces were hidden behind visored helmets, their eyes cold and impassive as they faced the surging crowd. Armed with batons, shields, and tear gas canisters, they were prepared for the inevitable confrontation, their orders clear: disperse the crowd at all costs and restore order to the city. But the protesters were undeterred. They had come prepared to stand their ground, knowing full well the risks they faced. Many had brought makeshift shields of their own, fashioned from wood and metal, while others carried nothing but their conviction and the belief that their cause was just. They moved as one, advancing slowly but steadily towards the police line, their voices never wavering as they chanted for freedom, for justice, and for Kodo. As the two sides drew closer, the tension in the air became palpable. The police, sensing the determination of the crowd, moved to deploy their most formidable weapon, a water cannon mounted on an armored vehicle. The cannon roared to life, unleashing a powerful jet of water that crashed into the front line of protesters with brutal force, sending many sprawling to the ground. Yet, even as the water cannon continued its assault, the protesters refused to be driven back. Those who fell were quickly helped to their feet by their comrades, and the line reformed as they pressed forward once more. The force of the water could not extinguish the fire that burned within them, a fire fueled by the injustice of Kodo's imprisonment and the harsh repression they now faced. In response to the protesters' resilience, the police escalated their tactics. Tear gas canisters were launched into the crowd, their acrid fumes spreading quickly and causing many to choke and gasp for breath. But even as the gas clouded the air and stung their eyes, the protesters did not falter. They covered their faces with cloths soaked in water or vinegar, determined to keep moving forward despite the burning in their lungs. The clash between the two sides grew increasingly intense. The sound of batons striking shields echoed through the streets, punctuated by the shouts of defiance from the protesters and the commands barked by police officers. The ground beneath them became slick with water and mud, turning the streets into a treacherous battleground where every step was fraught with danger. As the night wore on, the rain began to fall, its cold drops mingling with the sweat and tears of those who fought in the streets. The rain, heavy and unrelenting, turned the ground into a quagmire, making it difficult for both protesters and police to maintain their footing. But the downpour did nothing to dampen the spirits of the crowd. If anything, it seemed to strengthen their resolve. In the midst of the chaos, a chant began to rise above the noise, a single voice that soon grew into a chorus as more and more protesters took it up. "Free Kodo! Free Kodo!" they cried, their voices growing louder with each repetition. It was a demand that echoed through the rain-soaked streets, a demand that could not be ignored. Inside his prison cell, Kodo heard the distant roar of the crowd. Though he was separated from his followers by walls of stone and iron, their voices reached him, filling him with a deep sense of pride and determination. He knew that the struggle was far from over, but he also knew that he was not alone. His followers were out there, fighting for him, for their faith, and for the future they all believed in. Outside, the protest showed no signs of abating. The police, frustrated by their inability to break the crowd's spirit, resorted to more aggressive tactics. They charged at the protesters with batons and riot shields, determined to drive them back by sheer force. But the protesters fought back, using whatever they could find, sticks, stones, even their own bodies, to hold their ground. The clash between the two sides escalated into a full-blown battle, with neither willing to back down. The air was filled with the sounds of conflict, the crack of batons against shields, the shouts of defiance from the crowd, and the steady drumbeat of rain on the pavement. But even in the midst of this chaos, there was a sense of unity among the protesters. They were not just fighting for Kodo, they were fighting for each other, for their right to believe, and for a future where their voices could be heard. It was this unity, this sense of shared purpose, that gave them the strength to continue, even as the odds seemed insurmountable. And so, the streets of Gorilist became a symbol of resistance, a place where the flames of defiance burned bright against the darkness of oppression. The protesters knew that their struggle was far from over, but they also knew that they were not alone. They had each other, they had Kodo, and they had the unwavering belief that, in the end, justice would prevail. As dawn began to break over the horizon, the rain finally began to ease, leaving behind a city scarred by the night's events. The protesters, battered but unbowed, retreated to regroup, their resolve stronger than ever. They knew that this was just the beginning, that the road ahead would be long and difficult. But they were ready to fight for the freedom and justice that they believed in with all their hearts. In the heart of the city, as the first rays of sunlight began to pierce the clouds, a new day dawned, a day filled with the promise of change, of a future where the voices of the people would be heard, and where the light of Tsisu would shine brightly over all. The general's warning. As the streets of Gorilist continued to erupt with unrelenting protests, the tension within the government reached a fever pitch. The sheer magnitude of the demonstrations, now spreading like wildfire across the continent, had outgrown the capacity of the police to control. Faced with this mounting crisis, Ruda, the unifier of the continent and leader of the Gorilist regime, convened an emergency meeting with his top military advisors to strategize a response. The room was filled with the weight of the moment as the highest-ranking generals in the nation gathered around the imposing oval table. The atmosphere was thick with tension as Ruda, his face etched with frustration and determination, scanned the faces of those before him. These were men who had stood by his side through countless battles, who had helped him conquer and unite the continent under a single banner. But now, a new battle was upon them, a battle not against an external enemy, but against their own people. These protests must be quashed, Ruda declared, his voice cold and resolute. We cannot allow this insurrection to continue unchecked. The people must learn that defiance will not be tolerated. The generals nodded in agreement, their faces a mixture of concern and resolve. However, amidst the murmur of assent, one voice broke through, a voice that dared to challenge the prevailing sentiment in the room. With all due respect, Dataruda, spoke General Darren, a seasoned military strategist known for his wisdom and foresight. I believe we must consider a different approach. The people are not simply rebelling without cause. They are driven by a sense of injustice, and in this situation, I am reminded of the ancient wisdom that water can carry a boat, but it can also capsize it. If we do not listen to the voice of the people, we risk capsizing our own ship. A hushed silence fell over the room as General Darren's words hung in the air. The tension was palpable as the other generals exchanged uneasy glances. Ruda's eyes narrowed, his jaw clenched in barely restrained anger. The audacity of Darren's statement, to question his authority at such a critical moment, was something Ruda was not prepared to tolerate. Before Ruda could respond, another voice joined in. General Coven, a respected commander with a reputation for his strong moral compass, spoke up in support of Darren. Dataruda, General Darren makes a valid point. The people are the foundation upon which our power rests. If we lose their support, we lose everything. Perhaps it is time to acknowledge the innocence of Kodo and seek a resolution through dialogue rather than force. The tension in the room deepened as General Yaren, another senior military leader, nodded in agreement. "We are soldiers, not tyrants," he said, his voice steady but firm. "Our duty is to protect the people, not to crush them. If we continue down this path of suppression, we may win the battle, but we will lose the war for their hearts and minds." Ruda's fury erupted like a volcano. His fists slammed down on the table, the sound echoing through the chamber as he rose to his feet, glaring at the dissenting generals with a gaze that could pierce steel. "Enough!" Ruda's voice thundered, quelling any further debate. "You dare to defy me? You dare to question my judgment? I have brought this continent to its knees, united it under one rule, and I will not allow it to be torn apart by a group of misguided zealots and their delusional leader." The room fell silent, the generals stunned by the intensity of Ruda's anger. Ruda's authority had never been questioned in such a direct manner, and the consequences of this defiance were about to become painfully clear. "I will not negotiate with traitors," Ruda continued, his voice low and seething with contempt. "Kodo is a threat to everything we have built, and I will not rest until he is crushed beneath the weight of my power. Those who stand with him are enemies of the state, and they will be treated as such." He turned his gaze to General Darren, his eyes blazing with fury. "You, Darren, have crossed the line. You are dismissed from your post, effective immediately. You are no longer fit to serve in my army." The room was struck by the severity of Ruda's decision. General Darren, a man who had served the guerrillist regime with honor and distinction, was being cast aside for daring to speak his mind. But Ruda was not finished. "General Coven, General Yaren," Ruda continued, his voice dripping with disdain, "you have shown where your loyalties lie. You too are dismissed. You will no longer serve under my command." The generals were stunned into silence. The room had gone from a heated debate to a purge of the military's top brass in mere minutes. The remaining generals, those who had not dared to speak up, sat in uneasy silence, their loyalty now cemented by fear rather than conviction. Ruda, his anger still smoldering, turned to the rest of the room. "Let this be a lesson to all of you," he said, his voice cold and menacing. "Dissent will not be tolerated. We will continue our suppression of these protests with all the force at our disposal. Kodo and his followers will be brought to heel, and this insurrection will be crushed. Do I make myself clear?" The generals, now too afraid to defy him, nodded in silent agreement. The message was clear: Ruda's rule would be absolute, and any challenge to his authority would be met with swift and brutal retribution. As the meeting concluded, the dismissed generals were escorted out, their careers and reputations shattered. The others, though still in their positions, were left to grapple with the fear and uncertainty that now gripped the military's leadership. The path Ruda had chosen was one of iron-fisted control, and they were all bound to it, whether they liked it or not. But as Ruda stormed out of the room, his mind still clouded with rage, he failed to grasp the deeper implications of his actions. The warnings of the generals, the ancient wisdom that water could both carry and capsize a boat, were lost on him. His focus was on immediate control, on maintaining his grip on power at all costs, not realizing that the very people he sought to suppress were becoming the force that could ultimately overturn his reign. Unbeknownst to Ruda, the seeds of dissent had already been sown within his own ranks. The dismissed generals, though stripped of their positions, would not simply fade into obscurity. They would become symbols of resistance, their voices amplified by the very injustice that had silenced them. And Kodo, the man Ruda had underestimated, continued to capture the hearts and minds of the people, his influence growing even stronger in the face of adversity. The stage was set for a confrontation that would shake the foundations of Ruda's empire. The battle lines were drawn, not just between Ruda and Kodo, but between the forces of oppression and the unyielding spirit of the people. And as the drums of rebellion began to beat louder, Ruda would soon learn that the power he wielded was not as absolute as he believed. For in the hearts of the people, the flames of defiance burned brighter than ever, fueled by the knowledge that, just as water can carry a boat, it can also capsize it. The night of shattered dreams. As night fell over the city, a veil of tension descended with it, thick and suffocating. The streets, once bustling with the fervor of protest, now stood on the brink of an explosive confrontation. The wide road that had become the epicenter of Defiance was crowded with demonstrators, their faces illuminated by the soft, flickering glow of lanterns held aloft like beacons of hope in the encroaching darkness. Their voices, resolute and unwavering, rose in powerful chants for freedom and justice, echoing through the night air with a defiance that seemed to challenge the very forces aligned against them. Across from the mass of protesters stood the army, a wall of disciplined might bristling with weapons and steely resolve. Soldiers, clad in dark uniforms and armed with the tools of oppression, formed an unyielding line, their expressions hardened by the knowledge of what was to come. The cold gleam of their rifles reflected the distant lantern light, creating a foreboding contrast to the warmth of the demonstrators' hopes. Orders were barked, demanding the crowd disperse, but the people held their ground, undeterred by the threats of violence looming before them. Time seemed to stretch in the charged silence that followed, each second ticking by with a heavy weight that pressed upon the hearts of all present. The tension was palpable, a taut string ready to snap, and when it did, it was with a ferocity that none could have fully anticipated. The first crack of gunfire ripped through the night like a thunderclap, startling both protesters and soldiers alike. It was a sound that heralded chaos and despair, shattering the fragile peace that had lingered on the edges of this standoff. In an instant, the soldiers' rifles came to life, unleashing a storm of bullets that cut through the air with lethal precision. The crowd erupted into chaos as the reality of the situation hit with brutal force. Screams of terror filled the air as the protesters scattered, their chants of defiance replaced by cries of fear and pain. The once unified mass now became a disoriented throng, people running in every direction, desperately seeking cover from the deadly hail of bullets. Some ducked behind hastily erected barricades, others darted into alleyways, their frantic attempts to escape the onslaught creating a scene of utter pandemonium. The air, thick with smoke and the acrid scent of gunpowder, was alive with the cries of the injured. Blood stained the cobblestones, a grim testament to the price of resistance. Those who had been struck by bullets lay sprawled on the ground, their bodies racked with pain as they clutched at their wounds. Makeshift medical stations were set up in the midst of the chaos, where volunteers, their hands shaking with urgency, tried to tend to the injured with whatever supplies they could find. The lanterns that had once symbolized hope and unity now cast eerie shadows across the scene of devastation. Their light, once steady and bright, now flickered ominously, as if struggling against the encroaching darkness. The peaceful demonstration had been transformed into a nightmare, the dream of justice and freedom drowned in a sea of blood and fear. Yet, amidst the horror, the spirit of the protesters remained unbroken. Even as bullets tore through the night, even as friends and comrades fell beside them, the resolve that had brought them to the streets did not falter. Those who had taken to the streets in the name of Kodo, in the name of justice, found within themselves a strength they had not known they possessed. They had come knowing the risks, knowing that the path to change was fraught with peril, and yet they had come all the same. And now, even in the face of such overwhelming violence, they refused to be cowed. In the dim light of the lanterns, amidst the chaos and carnage, pockets of protesters continued to hold their ground. They chanted still, their voices hoarse but determined, their words a defiant declaration that they would not be silenced. For every person who fell, there were others who stepped forward to take their place, to carry on the fight. The flames of their resistance, though battered and bruised, burned on with an intensity that no amount of violence could extinguish. As the night dragged on, the streets of Guerillist were transformed into a battleground, the clash between the army and the people reaching a fevered pitch. The soldiers, following orders, continued their brutal crackdown, but the protesters met them with unyielding defiance. They had been prepared for this moment, had steeled themselves for the possibility of violence, and they would not back down now. By the time the first rays of dawn began to creep over the horizon, the streets were littered with the debris of a night of unbridled violence. Bodies lay scattered across the blood-stained cobblestones, the wounded groaned in pain as they were tended to by those who had managed to avoid the worst of the violence, and the city itself seemed to sag under the weight of what had transpired. But even as the light of a new day began to push back the darkness, the spirit of the protests remained unbroken. The people had come together in defiance of an oppressive regime, and though they had been met with brutal force, their resolve had only been strengthened. They would not be silenced, would not be cowed into submission. The memory of the night's horrors would serve as a rallying cry, a reminder of the price they were willing to pay for the freedom they sought. The story of the night of shattered dreams would spread like wildfire across the continent. The brutality of the crackdown would not go unnoticed, and the courage of those who had stood their ground would inspire others to take up the cause. Ruda's regime, though powerful, would find itself increasingly isolated, its legitimacy eroded by the blood it had spilled in the streets. The struggle was far from over. The battle for justice, for freedom, for the very soul of Guerrillist had only just begun. And as the people picked up the pieces of their shattered dreams, they did so with the knowledge that they were not alone, that they were part of something greater than themselves. They were the water that could carry the boat, and if need be, they could also capsize it.